for joining us today. We're very, very excited to have Dr. Joe Regenstein from Cornell University here to do a special lecture. And Dr. Regenstein, I'm just going to quickly read his bio, which most of you have read. He's a professor of food science at Cornell University, and his research has focused on flesh foods, fish, poultry. He's spoken throughout the world on subjects of kosher and halal foods. So you guys are very lucky because he is a world expert on this topic. So if you have questions, please ask. You probably won't have another opportunity like today. And he leads the Cornell Kosher and Halal Food Initiative, which provides extension and outreach services to the kosher and halal food sector. So he's going to give his presentation, and then he's going to leave some time afterwards for questions and answers. And then we have a small reception planned over across in 112 in the kitchen. So you're welcome to join us if you want to talk with him a little bit more one-on-one. And with that being said,
Thank you, Chloe. Thank you. It's certainly my pleasure to be here. In Ithaca, I'd say it's a beautiful day, and I didn't expect anybody to show up. But I realize out here you have beautiful days all the time. It actually got nice in Ithaca, but earlier in the week we were at about 10 degrees Fahrenheit. So I come from a different part of the world. What I want to do this afternoon is kind of give everybody a brief introduction to the kosher and halal laws, both as laws, the demographics, the industrial look, and then end up with a little bit of philosophy. And I guess one of the questions my wife keeps, who actually taught high school in her early career, was, what's in it for you? Why should you want to know this? And basically, it's an extremely important part of the food industry. So those of you who are food science or nutrition, on the food science part, and I'll come back to it, but one comment is that 40% of packaged goods in the United States have a kosher marking on it. So if you're in the food industry, it's a major thing. If you're in nutrition dietetics, in many hospital situations, you're going to hit people who have various dietary restrictions, of which kosher and halal are two of those restrictions that you're going to run into. So it's very much a part of it. And I also gather we have some folks from groups like Jewish Studies, and kosher is part of what it means to be a Jew. So I hope that each of you will recognize that there is a relationship to this, and that's how and why at Cornell we have a kosher and halal food initiative, which serves a number of stakeholders, the consumer being one, the industry being another. We actually work with the rabbis and Muslim leaders because they have to understand the food industry. So I teach kosher and halal to the food people, and I teach the food stuff to the rabbis and to the Muslim leaders. And then we also have the government, which gets involved in how do you regulate these things, and what are some of the issues, and how do we deal with them responsibly. So we did a paper on biotechnology. One of our guests from off campus was asking about GMOs, and the question, and I'll try to bring it in, of how does the government folks, actually FDA, Center for Food Safety Applied Nutrition, says we need to understand as we try to regulate GMOs, where do the religious groups stand? Whatever it is, and we just want to know. And so we ended up doing a biotech paper really at the request of the head of the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, who at the time was Fred Schenk, who was a personal friend and who was very active in IFT, which is a professional organization. It wasn't a formal thing, but he strongly encouraged me to do it. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about kosher, which are the Jewish dietary laws, and the word kosher means fit or proper, and the opposite is normally the word treif is used for not kosher. In the Muslim world, the word is halal, which is lawful, and haram, which is prohibited. And I want you to enjoy this advertising. This is my epitaph. I was involved in the conspiracy that took Oreos kosher. And this is a kosher symbol, which you'll learn as you go through, and we will have one slide where we tell the story when I can frame it in terms of the most complex kosher conversion in the food industry, to the best of my knowledge. So again, the food industry, here's a small company, used to be Nabisco, was Kraft, it is now Mondelez. These are international companies, and they chose at some point to go kosher with their cookie line. And so we can talk about that. So, okay, some initial clarifications. The most important thing is that kosher and halal are laws and lawful. It is not about being blessed. When the rabbi or the imam or the Muslim supervisor comes to a food plant or a restaurant and says the product is kosher or halal respectively, they are not blessing your food. They are there as an auditor. Your plant is either kosher or not kosher, is halal or not halal, because that's what is. But what they're doing is now giving you a third-party certification, an outside certifier. They're coming in, working against their rule sheet, which is what we will go through to see so that one understands, can one go kosher? What might be involved in running a food plant that is kosher? But they're there to see that you're obeying the rules. And we actually, in New York, because of our crazy legal structure around this, we had a plant that the rabbis came in, they did the kosher, they ran a production run for 3 weeks, and after that, they left. And the company said, well, we were kosher on Friday afternoon when the rabbis left. We're still kosher on Monday morning, and they started to claim they were kosher. And because of the rules in our state, not religious law, there was a real question. And I actually, in that discussion, defended them in a forum that we had under the governor of the state at the time that I was participating in, and said they are kosher. They're not dishonest and they're not misleading, but they have to understand that that claim is going to cause problems down the road because, in fact, it is not being supervised, and if they make any changes, they could get in trouble. So, again, it's an audit, and that's the critical piece. The only place where you get a little bit into the blessing is at the time of slaughter. Taking the life of an animal in both religions is treated as a sacred act, and therefore doing that requires some kind of blessing, recognition that you are taking the life of an animal. And so that's the one place where it's different. And for the Muslims in particular, it's over every animal. For the Jews, it's once as a person begins the process of killing a collection of animals, he will say a blessing. Interestingly enough, in the Jewish community, you have to be very specifically certified to kill, and it's strictly male. In the Muslim community, in fact, sane adults may kill an animal. So we have, in terms of animal welfare education, which I'm involved in, the challenge in the Muslim community is that in theory, every Muslim can slaughter, adult Muslim can slaughter an animal. Okay, so let's start by going through the laws. I'm a fish guy. I have 45 fish ties, but this is the most kosher one of my ties. And you'll understand that in a minute. Both kosher and halal deal with what are you actually allowed to use as food animal. What animals can you use for food? And the kosher laws are that ruminants with a split hoof and chew their cud are kosher. And if you look in Hebrew scripture, and I call it Hebrew scripture as opposed to Christian scripture rather than Old Testament and New Testament, because I've gotten nailed by the Orthodox rabbis, it cannot be the Old Testament if we don't recognize the New Testament. So I will use terms of Hebrew and, if needed, reference to Christian scripture. And of course, I also do dates. Jews and Muslims tend to use dates as common era and before the common era, since in fact centering everything around a Son of God that we don't believe is the Son of God causes a conflict. So ruminants have a split hoof and chew their cud. One animal that one might expect, because it is a ruminant, is the camel. The camel is not up there because, in fact, it has webbing on its feet. It is not a true split hoof. On the other hand, what's very obviously out there also is the pig. And we will see in both Judaism and Islam that the pig is uniquely, even more so in Islam, singled out because it is the food of major food of commerce. Part of it, certainly from a Jewish, there's nothing special about the pig being banned. It's a monogastric. But in practical terms, in most societies, it becomes the symbol because, in fact, people use a lot of pork in Christian countries, and there's even some literature suggesting that in certain countries of Europe, the use of the pig or ham roast as the symbol of Easter and or of Christmas was in fact pushed in order to expose, particularly in Spain, Jews who had converted but weren't sincere in what would be a more public venue. So the pig is clearly special. I've just come back from China a week and a half ago, and trying to just avoid pork in China is a full-time job. I need 3 translators to do that because even vegetables, thank you, have pork, ground pork sprayed over it. It's impossible. The traditional domestic birds are kosher. There's argument over the peacock, and there's some cute stories about the peacock. In Israel, the peacock is kosher. In the United States, it's not. And that, again, I want to point out that these laws are basically the same globally for both Jews and Muslims, but when you get into the details, in most cases beyond what we want to do today, you will find differences. And sometimes in terms of which animals are considered kosher, there are, on the edges, some problems and disagreements. And both religions, and there are both quotes in both religions, respecting and accepting the idea that there will be a certain amount of disagreement among the religious leaders. Ostrich, emu, rhea, which we now have in the food supply, are very definitely not kosher. The modern translation of ostrich of the Hebrew scriptures into English talks about the ostrich as being a prohibited, specifically prohibited. Now, there's always this scientist and nagging feeling that you also see in religious texts is, remember, the Hebrew was written 3,000 years-ish ago, and when you come to naming animals, it can get a little confusing because we know that even in the modern era, we can talk about the same fish. Fish is one I know where there are problems. We talk about the same fish and mean different animals, and we can give the same fish multiple names as you go around the world that have nothing to do with each other. So, are we translating correctly? And then finally, my fish is fins and removable scales, which are the kind of scales you can scrape off. So, we do one fish cleaning a year, and I spend 3 days cleaning up the lab from all the scales that get scattered around. So, I know I'm working with a kosher fish. Again, there's some that get a little more controversial, and I've spent some time dealing with what is the reality there. I spend a lot of my current work because of issues in Europe around the slaughter, the prohibition of blood. Blood is the life fluid. And so the rabbis, actually banned, want to remove as much blood as possible. So there are very specific slaughter requirements, and I'm going to be polite and not go into a great deal of detail. If there's time at the end, we'll do a little bit. No blood and guts in the pictures. After slaughter, there's an inspection of the animals. The major thing they're looking at is the lung, and they're looking for lung adhesions, which is a separate, the lung being attached to the lung cavity. So there are strands, we believe they're probably collagen, that attach the lung to the lung cavity, and that's considered a defect, it's considered a health concern, and ironically, just within the last half a year, somebody actually did some herd health analysis, basically looking at weights of animals in a herd at the time of slaughter, and in fact, those animals that had lung adhesions had an average weight that was about 20 pounds lighter than the animals that did not have them. So one can actually see some negative impact. Following that, the animals have to be deveined. They have to have certain veins and arteries that are, this is a complex, you spend a year or two getting trained to do this, veins and arteries that have to be removed. And in commemoration of Jacob's bout with the angel I think that's back in Genesis, sure. He limped afterwards, and that was taken to mean the sciatic nerve, and the sciatic nerve has to be removed. Most of you, I think, could recognize removing a nerve isn't a lot of fun. And so in a practical, not a religious, historically not religious, we don't use hind quarter in Western countries where labor costs are so high and the expectation of meat quality is so high that it's just easier to move that into the regular meat supply. So in some countries, particularly those in North Africa and in the Middle East, there is still the tradition of removing the sciatic nerve. So in Israel, you can get hindquarter meat. Though most of us who come from a European background, our tradition doesn't have that, and we can't then eat it. But you can do it. Deer is fascinating. Deer, it's easy to remove the sciatic nerve. We're now seeing deer being slaughtered commercially. We have a deer farm in New York State, and the rabbinical organizations can't decide, and one says, yes, you can use the meat, and one says, no, you can't. So again, a modern debate on a new problem, and how does it get resolved? And then there's the salting and soaking, which is, or really soaking and salting. You soak for half an hour, you cover with salt, and then you leave the salt on for an hour, and then you do 3 rinses. Now the salt is interesting because for most of you, you've heard the term kosher salt. If you go to any supermarket, you can get kosher salt, and it actually says kosher salt. All the salt, if you look at all the other salts, they all, once you know what to look for, which we'll teach you shortly, they're all kosher. I'm not aware of anybody really in America other than sea salts and things. Again, now, 5 years ago I could have precisely said that all salt in America is kosher. We now have all these funny salts out there. I'm not ready to say they're all kosher. But kosher salt from the salt industry is a grain size, which is why the chefs like it. It's a coarse grain. And so that's what you're actually getting when you get kosher salt. Its religious role is that it doesn't dissolve in an hour. It covers the meat completely, or the poultry, but it doesn't dissolve. And so that's why you have kosher salt. I should say that these laws apply to the birds and the mammals. What's interesting is they do not apply to the fish, and we will see in a minute that in fact the fish then move into a totally separate category. And what makes it crazy for the food industry as a practical matter is that certain materials that are derivatives of our rendering industry, the byproducts industry, which of course these days is a wonderful thing in the sense that we're trying to be more sustainable. Well, the pig industry used to say we use everything but the oink. All these bioproducts actually have uses, and they end up in the food supply, and if they come from pig, there's certainly a problem. But the fact is that the animal hasn't been killed appropriately, even if it comes from a sheep or a cow. So that to run any kosher operation as a practical matter, you need to have these obtained from vegetable sources, generally slightly more expensive. the animal products are generally cheaper. So that's one of the things the rabbi or the imam is looking for. The Muslim community has the same problem, though again, because they're of a larger size, my expectation is in the next 20 to 30 years, and it may be sooner, we will begin to see products coming from halal slaughtered animals in the animal side being prepared as ingredients. Very limited at this point. The third component is the separation of milk and meat. And this goes back to a passage, again, in the first 5 books of Hebrew Scripture, which are the law books, which is, thou shalt not seethe the kid in the milk of its mother. And the rabbis, as rabbis are wont to do, decided to make this a lot bigger than cooking a kid, a young goat, in goat's milk, and they basically prohibit anything that's slaughtered from being cooked with milk. And some people see a symbolism, and that's fine, of what is the nourishment for life, the milk, versus the product of the slaughter of death, and trying to keep them apart. But that makes the fact that you then have 3 categories. Things are meat, they are milk, but not everything is milk or meat. And that creates the third category, which is parv, and that, or neutral, but the word parv will appear on packages. So you need to recognize. The spelling, when you transliterate, nobody agrees on spelling. There are no spelling tests in this department of transliteration. But this makes the product now, makes it harder for the food companies, but it also provides an entree point where other consumers can now use this. We have products that are certified as meat-free. There is nothing from an animal that's been slaughtered. We have things that are totally animal-free in the sense of slaughtered animals. Eggs, honey, and fish are parv. So you cannot call it vegan, but a parv product is maybe vegan, but if you're a vegan, if it has dairy on it or meat markings, you know you're not going to want it. So it serves for many consumers as a pre-screen, and that brings it into the very practical use. And then we're about to celebrate Passover, which does tie in again to Christian holidays. Easter is tied to Passover. Jesus' Last Supper was a Passover Seder, which is the celebratory meal at the beginning of Passover. And in the Jewish law, this brings it into the plant kingdom. There are 5 minor materials like wheat, barley, rye, and oats, and spelt, which is a kind of wheat, that are prohibited biblically. And so the only thing we can do is make unleavened bread, and then we have to make all sorts of things using the unleavened bread. So everything tastes like unleavened bread. And I challenge my food science colleagues, and I've tried to do some of these, and we've just gotten a big break, to make products that people who hate that taste would find acceptable. I don't mind it, my wife hates it. So I'm trying to make things for her that she can eat. Because she loves the holiday from the holiday point of view, but by the end of the week, she's hard to live with because she hasn't eaten anything. And so the big break we got is there are other things that have been added by the rabbis, like a few things like corn and rice, and the ingredients made from corn and rice. So you've got a lot of limitations. You use a lot of potato starch. You can use potato and tapioca starch. You can't use corn starch. In Europe, they use wheat starch, which is even more of a problem. It gets real messy. The big breakthrough is this year, the largest kosher certification agency is coming out with quinoa for Passover. But I haven't figured out how to make a cookie with just quinoa flour. That's the challenge. Can I make it with quinoa and potato starch and eggs, which are all allowed? Can I make a decent cookie or something that you could eat? We use a lot of quinoa. And then there's a whole bunch of other laws, and I think the next slide talks about them. I'm going to skip these, but some of these have interesting implications in food plants. and I will give you a reference to an article that we've written that covers all of these. The big one are the ones up here, which require Jewish participation in the production of things. Jewish cooking, Jewish baking, and Jewish cheese making. And those sometimes get done in some interesting ways. The Jewish baking is probably the one that's the most fun. In some of the places where you have an oven that needs to have Jewish baking, they put a traditional light bulb, and I don't know what the rabbis are going to do when we no longer have light bulbs, because we're supposed to be phasing them out, and that has a certain amount of heat, which is why we want to phase them out. But the rabbis love it because that's part of the heat of the oven. And so if they turn the light on, they can consider it acceptable. Rabbis sometimes can be very clever in figuring out the laws. Okay, switching over to my Muslim colleagues, they very specifically single out pork. Again, they basically allow a few more animals. In a practical matter, camel is acceptable in halal. It has a unique slaughter method that I won't describe because it's a difficult animal to slaughter. It's much bigger than most other animals that we traditionally slaughter. And not necessarily in a strictly religious law fashion, but as a practical matter, Muslims in general want to avoid the pig in much more strict form than Jews would. So Jews want to avoid the meat of the animal for food. Many Muslims would not want to use a paintbrush made with a pork bristle. They would not want to use pork leather. So they tend to carry it. Again, this will vary on what country and the degree to which a person chooses to practice these. I'm trying to give you a kind of, in both cases, a kind of what I call a normative standard. There are people further stricter, and I can go into tons of laws, and I teach a whole course on this to cover that. And there are people, such as myself, who keeps a kosher home, but we're certainly not keeping it to the level of all of these laws in their finest points. Part of the problem of being a professor in this field is I know too much. So I can tell you exactly what we're doing wrong in our house. Now, I can't blame it all on my wife because I'm the one who does the cooking and shopping. So I've got to blame it more on me than on her. And the other one is the drinking prohibition of drugs and intoxicants, such as alcohol. And by this, I mean drinking alcohol. As those of you who are food science nutrition who've had organic chemistry, we recognize that alcohol is also used as a family name for a whole bunch of compounds, none of which are of interest here. In fact, some of those compounds are used as substitutes in halal product production. There's the direct drinking of alcohol. There's the direct of adding sherry to a soup or something, clearly prohibited. But where it also gets a lot more complicated is when it's used in flavors. A vanilla extract, a maple extract, a lemon extract, that by law is 40 or 42% alcohol. An extract is an alcoholic extract. And so, in fact, how the Muslim community and the different agencies get around it is interesting. The bottom line in general is they will use a dried vanilla flavor, which means that some of the volatiles are lost during the drying process. So their vanilla is not as rich and well-rounded in flavor. And they also prohibit blood, but they do it only in the sense of slaughter. Their slaughter is identical to a first approximation to kosher slaughter. And in fact, one of my proudest achievements, besides the Oreo, which we'll come back to, is we actually got part of the Muslim community, a specific component of the Muslim community, and the Jewish community to do a joint slaughter where the front quarter went to the Jewish community and the hind quarters went to the Muslim community as halal meat. And that took a great deal of effort to actually do it to the strictest of halal standards. The key was that the prayer that has to be said over the animal in Arabic, Bismillah, Allah Akbar, God is great. And Allah, let me be very clear to everybody in this room, I hope all of you realize, Allah is the Arabic word for God. Those who are monotheistic, the God of Muslims, the God of Christians, and the God of Jews, the God is the same, whether you call him God or Allah. And so the rabbis have ruled that the Muslim prayer at the time of slaughter can be said by the Jewish slaughterman. Some argue that it's got to be out loud. We did that. The one thing I realized somewhat is that the Muslim should actually say it by having his hand on the shoulder of the Jewish slaughterman. That's an arrangement we haven't set up yet. We are looking at a new custom-designed kosher and halal slaughter operation in the Midwest, and that will probably be set up so that various combinations of things can be done to make that happen. Okay, those are the laws at 101, at the broad level. How do you tell a product is kosher halal? Some products just come out and say, we're kosher, we're halal. But in the traditional food world, there was a concern that it would turn other customers off. So there was a system developed of kosher and now halal markings of symbols. And you sort of got a hint at that and the Oreo. And then in the industrial side, when you're moving tanker trucks and boatloads, you end up with a set of letters and sometimes seals. We use various kind of sealing systems which are in Hebrew or Arabic. You seal a tank, and the religious person at the other end actually has to open the seal, knows exactly whose seal and what seal should be on it. So we can do traceability. This is a very popular topic in modern food. I actually ended up being interviewed by the consulting company for the federal government when it was working on some of the traceability issues. Because we've been doing traceability for many, many years. And that does mean we send people out to fields in Thailand. We got people into China, the parts of China that were not open to Westerners before it was really totally open with special permission, because the Chinese wanted to export products to countries where they needed to have kosher certification. So the rabbis, I've met some of these guys. I mean, they have some very interesting stories of going into China as the only Westerner in parts that had never seen a Westerner, and here their first Westerner is a rabbi in full rabbinical robes. Interesting culture. Some of the companies put these symbols, and here we now see the circle U in hidden, in sort of delicate, you got to really look for it. But some of them use it as an advertising mark and make it very prominent. So you have here Pepperidge Farm, and the D is for dairy. They're saying that this is a dairy product. This is the first kosher product going back to the 1920s, first industrial kosher product, which was Heinz vegetarian beans. Here's the circle U, but this was in the 80s when I captured this. It's been 60 years, and they actually advertise it on that limited space of a can label. Clearly, it's a marketing. Most companies pay for kosher out of their advertising budget. A few of them pay for it out of legal regulatory. That's an interesting practical aspect. Where do you pay for this? And those are the two most common. Kosher supervision is provided widely. I have a list globally of 1,200 plus kosher certification agencies and rabbis who do kosher certification, each to their own individual standard. This is freedom of religion in practice. This is Constitution Amendment 1 in practice. By the way, because it came up in earlier discussions here, this is the problem we had with organic. Everybody wanted a single standard. So the government stepped in, created a single standard that was actually higher than any of the standards that were out there. They took the strictest rules of each of the standards that were out there, California, Oregon, NOFA in the Northeast, and created a single standard, made it so that it became a government bureaucracy, and became so expensive that the average small organic farmer can't do it, so organic is now big companies. So be careful what you ask for, you might get it. You've got to be careful with the government. I actually spoke to them at the time and said I was opposed to the government doing this for just this reason of freedom of what is really a religion. It's a philosophy. But it's like a religion, and different people have different views. And why should the government be telling all of us what is organic? Whatever you may think of organic, plus or minus, this is not an endorsement of organic. But having the government set one standard is really a violation of people's individual rights to choose what they mean by it. These are the four major ones. Star K is in Baltimore. This is the Hebrew letter Kuf. It's called a Kuf. So this is the Kuf K, which is out of Teaneck. This is the Circle K, which is out of Brooklyn. And then here's the OU with a Parv product, just to give you, usually that's written out these days. Or if it has nothing on it, the default is Parv. I do not like that system because it causes labeling problems as companies make changes. These are the big four that certify and are also normative mainstream in that they will accept each other's products. I can tell you how each of these ones is a little bit different, but what we have created is what I would call a circle in which many different agencies are slightly different, but they all use each other's products, except for meat. They all insist on their own meat. Outside of that, there is a group to the right and a group to the left. More lenient for certain products, more strict for other products coming out of the very traditional communities who don't accept these symbols. But this is commercially where most companies go. There is one symbol that's slightly to the left that is still widely used, and occasionally will make its way into a plant or a restaurant of these companies, and that causes confusion, but it's really very simple. These are companies where they've let the regular rabbis in, the mainstream rabbis. Everybody knows they're doing everything the way it should be, and the fact that they're using a supervision that's not quite as good is then ignored because we know that the product, again, it isn't even if you don't trust the rabbi, if the product is kosher, it's kosher by whatever standard you choose. But if you have a standard, just because it uses somebody who may not be as reliable doesn't mean that the product itself can't be okay, depending on what the company does. So again, those cause some interesting situations. Those are the ones I get phone calls on. This is an interesting one because it's the letter K. You can't trademark the letter K. Every one of the others is a trademark. This is not. So you can't guarantee it, and most serious Jews will not accept this with two exceptions, Kellogg's and Pepsi. They use it, but they're big enough that everybody knows who the rabbi is, and the rabbi's okay. In fact, it's the rabbi for this group here, which is a group in Boston, which has this very funny symbol of a VH, which represents, in Hebrew, Vad HaRabbanim, the community of the rabbis. But when Friendlies and Hoods, which are two major dairy companies, one ice cream, one General Dairy, left New England, this is the Boston. When in New England, everybody knew it. It was the Boston group, it was their group. But when the companies got big enough to go to New York, nobody recognized these symbols, and they had to put the K on just to let you know. And this is an unusual product. It's a Master's Choice, which is a number of East Coast, US, and Canadian companies use this as their house upper end label. Many times with the supermarkets with private label, some of the supermarkets will have two levels, an upper and a sort of more low price. We went through the period with yellow labels and black letters and nothing, which was the real generics. And this was a meat product. I won't go through the use of the word glot, that would take way too long, but this was actually a general meat product. It's the only one I know that was being sold by a non-targeted Jewish company like Hebrew National or Manischewitz, but was really just a general product. Of course, it had so little meat in it, it didn't require USDA inspection. For those of you who understand, under 2% ingredient it does not need a USDA shield, which is part of, again, the interplay between the kosher and thing. This is a dual certified product. This is the kosher mark from a rabbi in Chicago. This is the FANCA mark, the Islamic Food and Nutrition Council, which is also in Chicago, actually just outside of Chicago. And I convinced them to keep the crescent. At one point, they wanted to go to a Circle M. I'm their only non-Muslim member. The head of that organization has a PhD in food science, so he and I work with him regularly, and you'll see some publications at the end. And this is Kosher and Halal. For the vegetarian, for the dairy products and the parv products, they're dual certified. These are shelf-stable, 3 to 5 years. They're part of the military meals ready to eat. So these are the meals repackaged in military packaging that are forward positioned for serving the military. And they're all made by one company, and she does a halal meat and a kosher meat, and that she does separately. She's a 5'2", gorgeous Catholic woman. I got to be a gorgeous 5'2" Catholic woman. She was supposed to give a talk, and at the last minute had to cancel, and so I was her substitute. So you got to think of me not as I am, but as a kind of attractive 5'2" brunette. And I've sort of talked about mainstream normative. I've given you these. The point I'm trying to make here is they're all within the circle. And there is a de facto standard in each country for both kosher and for halal. That is kind of a normative standard. It is what it is. It hasn't been defined ahead of time. It wasn't created. This is going to be the standard. And in fact, it does change as issues come up and as the politics of all of this sorts itself out, these standards do change. And at the moment in the kosher world, they're going to the right, they're getting stricter. In the Muslim world, I haven't seen where the pendulum's going to end up, but there are some real fights over what some of these standards should be. And so these are not stable. They're dynamic and they deal with the modern thing. And so again, in Israel and in Europe, for example, we will see different standards. Malaysia and Saudi Arabia and Morocco will have different standards. In fact, Saudi Arabia, and I don't mean this in any insulting way, but I have been with Muslims and I say, are we eating meat here today? And they have said to me, no, we're not eating meat. Their meat comes under Saudi standards and we won't use it. So you have a real dynamic. And one point I want to make to those in the food industry, and this is why China had to let the rabbis in. Many of the ingredients, certainly in the US system, are kosher only. Because of the practical needs, how you handle them, they're either kosher or they don't get in. The most dramatic being whey, the byproduct of cheese making, the dairy product, that's the protein that everybody's dumping into bars. Either it's kosher or it's animal grade. It's that dramatic. And that's caused some very interesting things that I wish I had time to tell the stories, but I can see I've talked too much, which I tend to do, so we won't. And I've talked about getting stricter. So let's tell the Oreo story now that you've got a framework. Here's the picture in the late 80s, I guess it was roughly mid-80s. I go to an IFT meeting, Institute of Food Technologists, for the folks who are not from the food community. And the director of marketing at Nabisco, because this was when it was still Nabisco, comes up and says, I got to talk to you, I got to talk to you. Anyway, she was somebody I knew. I mean, I had known her before. We've actually been at a social event or two before. And finally, she said, we're just not finding a time we can meet. I got an idea. When are you going to the airport? I said, that's great. That's roughly when I was going also. I said, I bet you're taking, as a professor, I was a young professor at the time, I bet you're taking the shuttle van with 15 people and 3 stops. He says, I've got a limo. how'd you like to go to the airport in a limo? So this discussion occurred in a limo on the way back to the airport. I think it was New Orleans, which is where we're meeting this year, but I must admit I'm not 100% sure. I'm old enough to be able to be senile. It's okay. And it had to do with ice cream. Here was Nabisco, current at that time, cookies and cream ice cream. It was the first ice cream with all the, with big things with pieces in it. I keep forgetting that there's an official name for those big pieces, but they were making it with pieces. And it turned out, for practical reasons, that the Oreo folks decided that they weren't going to make these cookies themselves, because these were just cookies. They weren't Oreos. There was none of that white cream. They were just cookies. And so they were making it with a company that happened to be kosher. And so you had kosher Oreo cookies, even though Oreos, the kind we would buy in the store, were not. And so the companies, ice cream companies, almost every company that does interstate shipping of ice cream is kosher. And so they all wanted this because they wanted to be able to have Oreos, cookies, and cream. This was one of the original attempts at co-branding, where you take another company's name and help sell your product. And Oreos certainly has a cachet. And the rabbi said, no. How can we explain to people that you've got a kosher Oreos cookie and cream when Oreos are not kosher? And so she was losing a lot of sales. And so she was unhappy. So we sat in the car and figured out how we were going to change things over. And I went down to Nabisco, and I spent a whole day down there talking to marketing and R&D and procurement and all those folks, and answering their questions and explaining all of this. And they then made the decision to go ahead. The problem they had is they had to kosher the equipment, which can be done, and we'll have a slide on the details of that quickly. And so what they ended up doing is they realized they couldn't do it in one fell swoop. They had belts. The belts are rubber. They will not withstand a blowtorch. For a bakery, you have to come in with a blowtorch. And by the way, if you want to kosher your home, in some parts, I suspect in Los Angeles basin, you can call a magic number and rabbis will come with their blowtorch and blowtorch your kitchen. And we actually wrote a piece on fire safety. They should know what the different fire extinguishers are. If they burn something with the blowtorch that they shouldn't, they should know how to use a fire extinguisher. So anyway, the belts could not withstand blowtorching. And the belts, Nabisco had essentially 100 lines, 10 plants, 10 belts per plant. These are 300 feet long, size of a football field. And they cost $150,000 a pop. So think about 100 of those. You don't just throw them away. So it was a phasing, took 3.5 years. One of the beauties of this was that they didn't forget me at the end. And so I got a shipment of Oreos long before they made it through market channels to Ithaca, New York, which is nowhere. But we actually get a lot of products. We're in the Syracuse market. Syracuse has national demographics. A lot of test markets. I get called from companies, please pick up some products and send it to me because we know it's in the Syracuse market and it's nowhere else and we want to see the product. So I end up doing competitive materials to companies sometimes. I went and bought every piece of tea, every box of tea that Bigelow made. I spent $150 on tea because Lipton's wanted it. I have a very close friend at Lipton's who was, in fact, a friend of the person here in Nabisco. So it took 3.5 years, and I was able to go around to the Orthodox Jewish community and say, now try a real cookie. And they got to try the Oreo. So that was fun to do, and that's probably my epitaph. From the industry point of view, I just want to remind you, it's a fee for service. It makes sense only if you make money. Again, you can't predict it, but you have to do your analysis. Clearly, it has an important impact on the food industry. And Nabisco and Kraft and Mondelez have all kept kosher because they do feel they get the benefit from it. The demographics are people who will use kosher in some form or another. I've actually sat in a mosque and explained which kosher symbols work for Muslims and which don't, because there are some nuances that do affect the Muslim community. Seventh-day Adventists follow Hebrew scripture loosely, certainly no pork. Vegetarians and all of these will use people with dairy allergies. This group probably was stronger 10 years ago than now, because guess what happened? Our government now is making allergy labeling a priority. So you don't need the kosher label, which 10 years ago it did serve. Quality conscious, there is a belief that, and the truth is that if you have FDA inspection, they're hoping to get better than once every 10 years. The goal in the new Food Safety Modernization Act is every high-risk food plant shall be inspected every 5 years. The weakest rabbinical inspection in the simplest plants is once every 6 months. So you know you've got a food inspector coming every 6 months, as opposed to taking a chance the FDA may not get around to you for another 10 years. So companies really have to do a lot to get organized. It's good for companies to be kosher, particularly small companies, even though what the rabbis are looking for, I would argue, does not necessarily have value per se, but it's the process of establishing and keeping records, etc., that does give you extra quality. Again, the Jewish demographics, the most important thing is that there are only 14 million Jews in the world. It's important in America, in Israel, obviously, and even in that community, most of the people who keep kosher is a small part of the community. It is not the predominant mode for Jews in modern America. And so the customers for kosher food, 2/3 are not Jewish or more. But they're only buying some products. I'm talking about people knowingly buying. You buy it by default. I mean, many of you bought lots of kosher products. I can go to any of your homes and I can guarantee you I'll find kosher product, but you may not have even paid attention. That doesn't count. We're talking about people intentionally. But the Jewish, of course, are all kosher. So in terms of dollars, it's much more on the Jewish side. Muslim population, they have never done internal demographics. It's not covered by the census. The Jewish community, until recently, it's gotten too expensive, actually did demographics, so we actually had real numbers. Muslims, I've actually met one or two self-identified Muslims who eat pork, much more solidly kept in the Muslim community. Many, many Jews in the more liberal ends will eat pork products. But this is the number to keep in mind. 20 to 25% of the world's population is Muslim. By the way, having come from China, that's the population of China, and the two sets overlap. Western China has a heavy Muslim population, and that's been a political issue over there. But the point being is, and then there's another 2.3 million people who, billion people, who live in countries that are functioning under Muslim law of some sort in terms of food. An example is Malaysia, which is fascinating. It's 55% Muslim approximately, with a large Indian and Chinese population. And so if you want beef, lamb, goat, it's halal. Whether you're Chinese, Indian, or Malaysian, which is the predominantly Muslim community, is Malaysian origin in Singapore. But if you want pork, you can get it, but it's distributed in a completely separate distribution system. So you cannot have non-halal beef or lamb, but there's a separate distribution system for pork, predominantly for the Chinese, because again, pork is not traditional in the Hindu and Buddhist communities that make up a large part of the Indian population. So it plays out in many ways. But as we globalize, halal is going to be where we're going to have to be. It has market impact. This is what a few years ago was the number. And again, the distinction I'm making is Cheerios. I had Cheerios for breakfast. Many of you may have had Cheerios or Corn Flakes or whatever. The product is probably kosher. I ate it and looked and said, oh, it's got a hechsher, it's a Jewish product, it's kosher, I'm happy. That's this market. This is the rest of you who are getting, and that's about a quarter of the supermarket dollar. 30 to 40% of grocery goods, but remember that doesn't count fruits, and kosher meat is handled separately. So the average supermarket, in terms of dollars, it's about a quarter of their dollar volume. That's a promotion. We've had some good success stories. Post which was Maxwell House and Post, which are the old General Foods before they merged with Nabisco or with Kraft and got Nabisco. Targeted the Jewish market for years, and they had much greater penetration. So in a Jewish home, the chances of finding Post cereals, which has now been bought out and has changed because it was number 3 and couldn't survive, but in the Jewish homes, it instead of 15% had 35% of the market. That was real target marketing, and these are some companies that have made changes in going kosher. I actually was sort of involved in the Nestle one in funny sorts of way. That's a good story more afterwards. But the failures are even more interesting. A soda company said, we're wasting our money. They took it off. Their sales dropped 20%. They went back to kosher very quickly. These are two interesting ones that I was both involved in, both of them in peripheral sorts of ways. We at one point had a global vitamin cartel. Vitamin prices were fixed globally. In America, Hoffman LaRoche was the company, and they were participating, and it's all documented in the legal record, so I'm not, just making this up. You can check it out. And this company, the small company, realized that we could make everything cheaper because they actually had real costs. Even being small, given the cartel price, they could undercut it. They came in, and who uses vitamins in the food industry? It's our morning pill. It's called cereal. Cereal is a vitamin pill in disguise. And they all would save money. But when you're paying $3.29 for a box of brand name cereal, and the vitamin pill they were buying from Hoffman LaRoche cost them $0.01 a package, saving a half a penny and not being kosher wasn't worthwhile. And the company realized that everybody wanted a kosher certificate for these things. And that's when they called me, but it was too late. They eventually got bought out by one of the cartel members to get them out of the business, but then the cartel fell apart. The other one was a dairy industry, Dow Chemical, I think was the other party, to take whey to lactic acid. We talked about whey, which is lactose, which is milk sugar, which is unique lactose, lactic acid. Commercially, that's not how it's made. But this would be a very inexpensive way to do it. And it was a fermentation product, for the food science types. And I kept going they were at IFT advertising this for 5 years running. And I'd always go up to the guy. After the first year, we had a long discussion. I said, this doesn't make sense. Nobody's going to buy it. All lactic acid is kosher, but it's par. And where do you use lactic acid? You use it in pickles and in olives. It's the major users. And who wants a dairy pickle? You want it with your pastrami sandwich. So, in fact, so each year we'd go up and I'd say hi, and I said, has anything changed? No, we're not in production yet. And then eventually I met the same guy. He no longer worked for this company because it didn't exist anymore, because in fact he said there were other problems, but they never actually overcame the problem that nobody wanted a dairy lactic acid. So even just the categorizing between parv and dairy can have a tremendous impact on the food industry. Transportation and trucking and boats also have kosher implications. All the equipment has to be kosher. All the equipment has to be halal. And so you have to be able to transition. And the fact is you can. As I implied for the Nabisco case, you can transition. Some companies transition once a week. That means they have to have a rabbi in their plant at 4 o'clock on Monday morning. You go to an airport on the East Coast, probably here in LA, on a Sunday morning, you will see what are obviously rabbis, they're obvious, going out on a Sunday morning almost regularly because they've got to be in plants at 4 o'clock on Monday morning to kosher the plant in time for the 7 o'clock shift. And the normal koshering, which is for hot products above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, is the nominal set point. That's a whole story that I don't want to go into with trying to get through this quickly. It's a normal cleaning, general industry standard, but it's the 24-hour idle time, which is why it's Monday morning. The equipment's left open over the weekend, and then it's flooded with boiling water. The hot dry is the heat, is the blowtorch, and if it's cold below 120 degrees, it just needs normal industrial cleaning. Got to be absolutely clean. Muslims basically use the simple washing. The only time there's a problem is if there was pork around, they often will require an abrasive to actually rub things off. Rarely, and they do not like, for example, they will not use a slaughterhouse that on alternate days does pigs. Again, the rabbis will sometimes use a slaughterhouse that kills pigs on a different day. It's not a problem. For Muslims, that is a problem. The market for halal as an organized market is about 50 years behind the kosher, which is about, they started about 70 years behind us. They're catching up. And of course, trying to do this globally with 1.3 million is not easy. Getting all these different countries to agree, but we do see it, and here is the halal product. And this is, in fact, for my brunette here. This is Mary, Joseph, and Mary. Her name is Mary Ann, and her husband is Joseph. So, good Catholic names. He's Italian, she's Irish. So I guess from a Catholic perspective, it's a mixed marriage. And this is just a blow-up of that. We are working on the slaughter. I'm going to just flip through these. One of the problems is we've been working in many languages because we're dealing with people, even in America, representing many language groups. We've worked on knife development. I had no check luggage, so I couldn't bring this along. This is a special knife we've designed for the Muslim community. And this is small-scale slaughter equipment done with Temple Grant and the autistic woman at Colorado State who specializes in slaughter. And it's a double rail, which is one of the calming things, and it's a no-slip floor. Again, I could talk about this quite elaborately. This is an animal sat there for 50 minutes. The point being, you can actually, I think, feel from the picture the animal's calm. The beauty of these systems, when used properly, is even if the animal was agitated, it calms down. So before slaughter, we have a calm animal, which is extremely important. And that's my favorite picture. I use it on my bio sheet. That's me being kissed by a goat. We did no slaughter that day, so there's no blood, no animals got hurt. That's the Humane Society rejoinder. But I love that picture. And this is a poster. This happens to be Farsi, which is the Persian language. Are these health laws? Probably not for kosher. And here's a little science. Trichinosis. We all know you got to cook pork thoroughly because of trichinosis. It's a problem. There's two problems from a food safety, public health thinking about this. We built the pyramids. I often want to take some rights. I think we ought to be getting part of the commission for the tours in the pyramids since my people built them as slaves in Egypt. But those guys who got buried in those pyramids took food with them for the afterlife. And so we have mummified pork, and there are no signs of trichinosis, which you would expect in mummified pork. So there's a question of if trichinosis actually existed in pigs at that time. And the other problem is incubation time. It's a 10-day incubation period. Anybody here can tell me what they ate for lunch 10 days ago? If you eat the same thing every day, you can. But other than that, you can't. So to trace it to something you ate 10 days ago or more caused you to get sick. We didn't know this until the 17 or 1800s. To think that 3,000 years ago they figured that out isn't likely. So you don't have it. The Muslims frame things as religious and health. They're considered health, but every time a Muslim tries to give me a set of scientific arguments, they're just nonsense. My wife is the third author. She's a teacher, Spanish teacher slash administrator. And she looked at them, and without being a scientist, she says, none of these make any sense. And so we've dropped them from anything we write, and most of the Muslims, when I sit down and go over this with them, they will drop it because you cannot make a scientific argument. But you can talk about health in its broader, holistic form of leading a healthy life, of being of sound mind and spiritual health. So yes, it's health, but not thing. Finally, I'll give you a quick quote, and I realize some of you may have classes, so is that, and this is accepted by the Muslims. We use this even though it happens to be from a Jewish source. It's about holiness, moral freedom. People who do not obey the law are freer than the law-abiding people. We all want to feel that we don't have to abide by law, but they're basically following animal inclinations. And so the emancipation from that is the voluntary submission to a moral law. And no animal that I can imagine, they can talk, they may be able to communicate, but they're not going to go to an outside moral code. This is something only humans can do. So no matter what we learn about animals, it is one of the ways we separate ourselves. So again, ethics and law in Judaism and Islam are totally tied together, and it's dealing with the daily life. The big difference in Judaism and Islam versus Christianity, for example, is that our laws are all imposing on an everyday basis, as opposed to Christianity, which in fact actively, and I think there are people here who can go through the early period much better than I can, actively rejected the Jewish laws. And Islam, many years later, brought them back into their system. So, again, there's a website. Cornell has some stuff with Temple Grandin. I'm happy to make these PowerPoint available. We now even have a Chinese version of our major paper here. We just got that 2 weeks ago in China. They finished translating. So with that, I'll try to take a few minutes of questions here, and then I guess there's a reception, and happy to keep talking to anybody who wants to talk.
So I'm not familiar, or I wasn't as familiar with the forbidden grains during Passover. So my question is, what is matzah traditionally made of? Because
I said, the one thing you can do is make the unleavened bread, which is made from wheat.
sorry, I didn't hear that. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, I said it very fast. The point being is it's got to be wheat-based. And it's very specifically handled, very strict rules on how it's baked, and then you can grind it up. But try thinking about doing all your baking with breadcrumbs. That's what it amounts to, and it's not a leavened one. It's baked in 18 minutes. There's some very strict rules on how.
I was wondering, last year, I don't know if you're aware, but Trader Joe's made their chocolate chips from Parve to dairy. I was wondering if you just had any details about that. I know, at least in my community, it was like a really big deal because no more chocolate chips bottle out.
This has been an issue. Some companies have buckled. Stella D'Oro tried to go from Parve to dairy and backed off. Duncan Hines did it and backed off. Unfortunately, Trader Joe's or whoever was supplying them did not go. I mean, there's a fundamental problem that has arisen in chocolate because of allergies. We used to allow plants under very complex situations to go back and forth between Parve chocolate and dairy chocolate. Because the Parve chocolate was enough to make people ill, we had cases, and I got the phone calls sometime, where somebody got sick on a Parve chocolate who showed up with their dairy allergy. And with the testing that's now being done a lot of it in Nebraska, it was clear that there was dairy contamination. I actually was called into a chocolate plant on behalf of the company that wanted to prove that it wasn't a problem. I walked into that place and I said, this is an allergy disaster. And so part of that is running the chocolate lines, Parve versus thing, and it may be that the rest is dairy and they just really couldn't do it. So they may not have had a choice.
On a similar note, so in other words, this idea of things that are dairy, Parve, of course, is much more desirable because you can eat it a different way. So the idea of Nabisco Oreo cookies. So Oreo cookies are OUD, OU dairy. However, they contain no dairy products as far as I know. But the fact that it's labeled dairy keeps Jewish people from eating it with meat. And that's sort of a problem. You can increase sales of Oreos if they were labeled parve as opposed to being labeled
The
dairy.
problem there is it's not clear of one of the trace ingredients. Remember, we do not label everything on a food product. Between processing aids and climate, you cannot assume it's dairy, but there's one of the big controversies among the four of the big agencies is two of them will mark what is called dairy equipment, and two of them won't. The OU will not market dairy equipment. So you have products that are cooked on lines that are not parve. They have not been kosherized. They are dairy lines, but there is no dairy in the product. If you mark it as dairy equipment, which Circle K and Cuff K will do, there are leniencies you can do in terms of using it. So you can use it immediately after a meat meal, which you cannot do with a dairy product. But that's a fundamental disagreement between those agencies, and the OU doesn't allow it. Because remember, these baking lines are also doing your Chips Ahoy, they're doing your Fig Newtons. By the way, the Fig Newton, as it comes out of the bakery, is 350 feet long. It's a continuous feed. It's an extruded product, comes out and is cut after baking, which is that is one of the most fascinating products. Is you look in the oven and there's you can see 100 feet in, and there's this continuous Fig Newton. Or whatever. So again, they do have some of the products are dairy, and so they just keep the system dairy. And yes, it would definitely benefit if they could even put the DE if it is truly DE. And of course, if they could go parve, would even be better. But we all have to have our Oreos with milk anyway. By the way, and then I'll let you go. Food science, not kosher. Cookies break. Companies end up with a bunch of broken cookies. So the Oreos are made with 8% rework. So if they don't have enough broken cookies, they throw the broken cookies, they make broken cookies. 8% of the batter is cookies that were previously baked, which means that the white stuff, the cream that you so carefully separate and twist and turn, the cream's in the cookie. And that's the difference between the ice cream cookie. There was no cream in it. It was baked as a straight cookie. All the actual Oreo cookies, there's some of the fat in the white material in the cookie. My wife was devastated. And with that, I guess I ended up pretty close to on time. I know some of you have to go to classes. I'm happy to keep answering questions here, where the reception is, or wherever they tell me to go.